And we are back for some more Seattle Kraken expansion draft speculation. And I've said it a number of times in the videos so far to this point in the series, and I'll probably say it again a few more times in the videos to come, but the position group that the Kraken will have the hardest time finding the best quality players in will be the forward group. Fortunately for Seattle though, when it comes to the team that we're going to be talking about today in the St. Louis Blues, even though they have had a little bit of turnover since their Stanley Cup win a couple of years ago, there still is a significant amount of depth on this team, and especially in the forward position for Seattle to pick from. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. Now, like I said with the Blues, they have had a little bit of turnover since the summer of 2019, which is to be expected. But their championship window is still very much open, and they look to be keeping it open for at least the next couple of years. And while, especially with the salary cap likely staying where it is for the next couple of years, the Blues will have some decisions to make as to who they can get re-signed in the years to come, especially with a couple of key UFAs coming up this season. They are still set up pretty well to keep this core together and keep that window and chance of getting a second cup open. Which is in large part due to that fact that they do have pretty good depth, especially on the forward end, but even on the defensive end, which does play right into Seattle's hands when it comes to this expansion draft. But they still do get to protect 7 forwards and 3 defensemen. And yes, I do think it's very likely that they're going to be going that way rather than the 4-4 route because, well, I really just don't see any reason that they would be tempted into going the 4-4 route. So then on the forward end, when it comes to the 7 forwards that they'll be protecting, I do think it's pretty obvious that guys like Ryan O'Reilly, Robert Thomas, and Braden Shen are all pretty much locks to be protected, if not absolutely locks. And I also don't really see any reason that they would leave Jaden Schwartz exposed, so he also probably ends up on this protected list. And then as we do get to those last 3 protection slots, I do actually also think that 22-year-old Jordan Kyrou is basically a lock as he is part of the future of this team, and if he were to be exposed, I think he would be a pretty easy pickup for Seattle. David Perron, I do also think ends up getting protected here because even though he is 32 years old, he still does just have 1 year left on that contract, which will cost the Blues $4 million next year. Plus, when it comes to production, well, he's definitely still giving them that as he currently leads the team in points 28 games into the season. And then this last protection spot to me is a little bit less straightforward, but it ultimately comes down to either Vladimir Teresenko or Ivan Barbashev. But at least right now anyway, I'm certainly leaning towards this last spot, probably going to Tarasenko over Barbashev. And the reason I say that is because really the only big downside with Tarasenko is just the question of whether or not he can stay healthy and bounce back and become the same player he was after yet another shoulder injury. But with coming into the season, there having been at least some question as to whether or not Tarasenko was going to get on the ice during the course of this season, the fact that he is already back and has 4 points in 4 games certainly seems to point the fact that he is back and might still be the player that he was when he left. And if that does continue to prove to be the case over the course of the rest of this season, then Tarasenko certainly does offer St. Louis more in the years to come, even if he is costing them $7.5 million for the next 2 years. Plus, even if it does turn out that he's still not quite at 100%, well, Barbashev has also found his way onto the IR with an ankle injury, so he's certainly not free of some questions there as well. Plus, he will be a UFA, so he does still have to get re-signed at the end of the year. Meanwhile, when it comes to the defensive end and the situation around protection there, well, things are actually somewhat similar because there are 2 of the 3 players that I think are pretty much locks in Torrey Krug and Colton Parayko. And then the question of that 3rd spot comes down to the more experienced but more expensive Justin Falk or the young soon-to-be RFA Vince Dunn. But once again, I am going to lean a little bit more towards the more experienced and established player in Falk and say that he probably has the edge to get that 3rd spot, at least right now anyway. And I'll go over why in just a second, but first we have to go over who the protected goaltender is going to be. But that's pretty obvious considering Binnington just signed a long-term deal, so he's definitely getting protected. So to get back to the Falk versus Dunn conversation, I'm picking Falk here largely once again because the Blues are fighting to keep that championship window open, and I do think that Falk offers them a little bit more on the defensive end, which definitely would seem to be the case based on the 2 players' play times so far to this point in the season. An argument could be made that Dunn might have more of an offensive upside, especially considering he's 4 years younger, but at least to this point in the season, Falk has been outscoring Dunn and is the leading goal scorer on the team defensively. Plus, on the defensive end, Falk does offer more when it comes to block shots and physicality, and both players have pretty respectable possession stats. So again, with all else equal, Falk does offer the Blues more over the next couple of seasons, which is probably what they're concerned about right now. Now, the obvious big downside with him, and what could end up getting him exposed, and honestly probably would if the Blues weren't looking to win now, is that contract that will be costing the team $6.5 million a year through 2027. Meanwhile, this year Dunn is costing the team just under $2 million, but he is set to be an RFA at the end of the season, so he'll be looking for an extension that will probably be costing them a little bit more than that. But in the end, I'm not exactly sure how much it's going to end up mattering which one of these players ends up getting protected and which one ends up getting exposed, because I do think, especially considering the talent that will be available on the forward end, the Kraken are probably going to be looking to take from there rather than the defense. So as we start looking at which players could be available for the Kraken to pick from, that's where we're going to start. And we'll start with Tarasenko and Barbashev, since one of the two of them will be exposed. At 29 years old, Tarasenko is the oldest of these players that I'm going to be talking a little bit more about with the Blues. But with that, on the forward end at least, he is the most experienced, having played in part of at least 9 different NHL seasons, with 511 games where he has 432 points on 215 goals and 217 assists, which does make him easily the most proven points producer of anybody that we're going to be talking about. He has been a near point per game player for the majority of his career, with really the only exception being the first 2 seasons he was in the league, but considering he didn't see as much ice time or games played in that time, it's not too much of a surprise that it took him a couple of years to get going. Again though, now the question with him is whether or not he can bounce back and continue to be the player that he was after his 3rd shoulder surgery in 3 years. But at least so far, having now played 4 games since coming back from his latest recovery, he does have again 4 points with 1 goal and 3 assists. So at least it's a good sign to this point. But with the 2-time All-Star having added a strong physical aspect to his game over the last few years leading into the shoulder injuries, it will remain to be seen whether or not he continues to do that or decides to favor his shoulder a little bit more. But at least when it comes to his advanced stats anyway, regardless of how physical he's chosen to play year to year, he has had very strong numbers there, especially in his possession metrics, with a 54.3 career Corsi for percentage and never having dipped below 52% leading into this season. And there is also his 52.2 career expected plus minus, with the strongest showing coming in that year they won the Stanley Cup with a 17.3 over the course of that regular season. So if healthy and if exposed, Tarasenko really could offer Seattle just about everything they're looking for on the forward end, especially if he maintains the physical presence that he's had over the last few years. At least when he's been healthy anyway. That having been said though, if he does bounce back once again, I do think that leads to him getting protected, which then would make Barbashev potentially the most tempting option on the forward end for the Kraken. The 25-year-old center has now played in at least part of 5 different NHL seasons, in that time having played 249 games where he has 83 points on 39 goals and 44 assists. So at least from a points per game standpoint anyway, he certainly is not the player that Tarasenko is. Although that being said, it is fair to mention that he has spent most of his career on the 4th line where he really hasn't seen the amount of ice time that Tarasenko has. So with that in mind, his points production is actually pretty respectable, plus the fact that while he has been on the ice, he has been a very physical player, especially with his 144 hits in 69 games last season. And advanced stat-wise, even though his career Corsi for percentage is below 50 at 48.5, and he does have a career expected plus minus of negative 10.2, being on the 4th line will probably do that to you, and at least by watching him, he does seem to be a pretty strong two-way forward, even if the stats don't necessarily reflect it to this point in his career. And again, especially considering the fact that he really hasn't had that much time beyond the 4th line, if he were to come to Seattle, he certainly would get more of an opportunity, and he could have a ceiling that is much above what he's done so far. And plus, if he is able to maintain that amount of physicality with more time on ice, he certainly could be the type of player that an expansion team like the Kraken, especially with a GM like Ron Francis, would be looking for. Of course, all that being said, this is reliant on him being able to bounce back from the ankle injury that has him on injured reserve. A couple of guys on the forward end, though, that unlike Barbashev actually have started to see a little bit more ice time over the last couple of years are the 2 26-year-olds, Oskar Sundqvist and Zach Sanford. Both are certainly a little bit on the bigger end for forwards, and as a result, definitely play a little bit more of that physical game that the Kraken will probably be valuing when it comes to the expansion draft. Between the two, the center Sundqvist, who does actually turn 27 here pretty soon, has the little bit more NHL experience, having played in part of at least 6 different NHL seasons where he has 227 games, in that time scoring 72 points on 32 goals and 40 assists. Though it is maybe fair to point out that almost half of those points came in the 2018-19 season where he had 31 in 74 games. But ever since then he has been good for nearly a half a point per game, so that's still fairly decent for a bottom line physical forward, even if you probably would want a little bit more from a center. Meanwhile, Sanford, who plays on the wing, is now in his 4th NHL season, having played 184 career games with 70 points on 36 goals and 34 assists. And although at least to this point in his career anyway, his game too has also been focused a little bit more on physicality than points production. When it does come to points production, unlike Sundqvist over the last few years, he has been able to improve year to year. And also has the edge in point scoring so far to this point this season, with 12 points on 8 goals and 4 assists to Sundqvist's 9 points on 4 goals and 5 assists in a similar number of games. And from an advanced stat perspective, there really isn't a whole lot of difference between the two here either, again with Sanford having a slight edge over Sundqvist. So ultimately, for me at least, if it did come down to picking one of these two, which would probably mean that Barbashev's injury is a little bit more serious than we might have first thought, then I would probably lean towards Sanford. Although, that being said, Sanford is set to be an RFA at the end of the season and will need a new contract, while Sundqvist is still under contract for the next couple of seasons at just under $3 million per. There is at least one other guy on the forward end though that could be worth looking at for the Kraken, and it's definitely a name that I've seen thrown around here and there quite a bit, and that is Sammy Blais. Now, at least to this point in his career so far, the 24-year-old winger really has not done all that much to establish himself at the NHL level, outside of the 155 hits that he was credited for in 40 games last season, which is pretty significant. But especially with forwards, he won at least some level of points production, and with just 27 points on 12 goals and 15 assists in 101 games so far to this point, he really has not been able to provide that. Now, he was able to score at a pretty healthy rate, near a point per game in both college and the AHL level, so maybe it will show up in the NHL, and at 24 years old again, he still has some time to get there, but it probably does need to show up sooner rather than later. So the upside with Blais certainly still could be there, and if it is, he probably would prove to be one of, if not the best options available for the Kraken from the Blues. But it certainly would be more of a gamble of a pick for the Kraken to make than some of these other guys. And with 7 points on 2 goals and 5 assists in 18 games so far to this point this season, whether or not he's going to make himself a tempting option for the Kraken is still very much up in the air. And that just leaves us with the two defensemen we talked about earlier, and we'll start with Justin Falk. The soon-to-be 29-year-old defenseman has played in 656 career games over the course of 10 NHL seasons, in that time having 287 points on 95 goals and 192 assists. Having played most of his career in Carolina, where he was an all-star in his rookie season and even received some Calder votes, Falk is one of the guys that's been added onto the Blues since their Stanley Cup win a couple years ago. Throughout his career, he's been a very solid defenseman wherever he's gone, and a physical one at that, with over 100 hits in 6 of his 10 seasons, and he's well on his way to getting there again this year, although it might not quite happen because of the shortened season. And on top of that, and a respectable amount of blocked shots over the course of his career, he also looks pretty good when it comes to his advanced stats, especially with the possession metrics, where he's been over 50% in his Corsi 4 ever since his 3rd year in the NHL, adding up to a career 52.2 Corsi 4 percentage. And again, although his career expected plus minus is a negative 9.6, he has been able to score at a pretty good rate for a defenseman. And really, to be fair, most of that negative came in his 2nd and 3rd NHL seasons, with his first one being before it was measured. Now again, the big downside for Falk is that contract, which again will see him earning $6.5 million per year through 2027, which is a pretty big pill to swallow, especially with the cap staying where it is for the next couple of years at the very least. And for the Blues, after his first year in St. Louis, that contract definitely looked even worse after he only scored 16 points in 69 games. But at least so far to this point this season, he has bounced back with 13 points on 5 goals and 8 assists in 28 games. So if he is able to keep that up and get back to being more of the player that he was in Carolina that the Blues thought they were getting, then they probably would still want to hold on to him, but again, that contract is pretty big and the Blues probably could use some help, especially with some contracts they're going to need to sign in the next couple of years, including this offseason. With of course at least one of those contracts this season likely going to Vince Dunn, who is set to be an RFA. The 24-year-old defenseman has played 4 seasons now in the NHL, where he has 251 games to his name, and in that time 91 points on 29 goals and 62 assists. But what, at least from a points per game standpoint, he may add in points production over Falk, he gives up in physicality, where he really has yet to add that to his game if he's going to. But if he is available and the Kraken can get their physicality elsewhere, then he certainly would look to be a pretty good pick for Seattle. When it comes to the possession metrics, Dunn has looked very good throughout the course of his career, with a career 54.8 Corsi for percentage, and has been near 55% in every season leading up to this year, where he's currently sitting at 52.4, but the Blues as a whole have been kind of down in that category, so that could still come up. And then even when it gets a little bit more towards the points producing metrics like expected plus minus, he already has a 34.3 career expected plus minus after just what is really 3 1/4 seasons so far. I'm really not sure how much of a point there is in picking whether I'd like Falk or Dunn, because ultimately that decision would be made by St. Louis as to which one would actually be available to pick. Plus, again, I'm not really sure how much it matters because the Kraken, if left to their own devices, will probably go with a forward here considering how much of a limited pool forwards are going to be across the league. Now I say left to their own devices because, at least with the Blues, a trade is still very much an option, although I don't really know how likely it is. Now there is at least some incentive for the Blues to make a trade here, at least if they want to keep all their forwards in St. Louis. And ultimately, whether or not a trade happens with St. Louis probably does come to how they feel about Falk at the end of the season, because if he does keep up the scoring pace that he's at so far to this point, then they probably won't be too eager to trade him and something to Seattle. And especially considering they're already missing their 2nd and 4th round picks in this coming draft, it's not like they have an abundance of picks to go throwing at this situation either. So really, as it stands right now, I don't think that a trade is terribly likely. I mean, there's always prospects as well, but really I think that the Blues are probably just going to be content with losing one of their forwards, which they can probably end up replacing with a similar guy. Oh, and as far as goalies are concerned, there's really not anything all that tempting here for the Kraken to pick. So ultimately, at least for me, again, I think that the Kraken probably take a forward here, and if I had my pick, assuming they're healthy, whichever one of Tarasenko or Barbashev is available would probably be my pick. Of course, if Sammy Blake can pick things up and look a little bit better towards the end of the season, then maybe he's a little bit more tempting, but as things stand right now, I just think that he's a little bit too much of a gamble for the Kraken to take from a team where they know that they can get a proven forward. So with that said, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Plus, I would love to hear your thoughts on the Blues, who you think would be protected, and who you might like to see in Seattle down in the comments section. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace!